I'm Daniel Tunklang from LinkedIn. It's a pleasure to have you all here in this track. And today I'm going to talk about how to interview data scientists when you're trying to hire. Now, if we want to think about interviewing data scientists, we are stuck with this problem of defining what a data scientist is. I'm a big fan of Drew Conway's Venn diagram. He actually wrote a whole blog post about this. And you know, the wonderful thing about a term like data science is that it's a bit of a Rorschach test in terms of how people see it. But I think that this diagram exposes it well. There's really a trio of skills that we're looking for. We're looking for, obviously, the math and stats skills, because we're talking about people who do data analysis. We're looking at the same time for hacking skills. These are people who are building things, or at the very least, need to be implementing the analytical visions that they have. And they need substantive expertise. That varies, of course, by where they work. At a company like LinkedIn, that's expertise in the consumer internet. But I know there are folks here from the automotive industry, from healthcare, and there, of course, some knowledge of the domain is crucial. I realize this may not entirely satisfy people as to a definition, but we need something to work with. So let's, if you don't like the definition, blame Drew. No, seriously, let's run with this. And our goal is to hire unicorns. This is a bit controversial, especially because unicorns themselves are a bit of a dicey concept. I don't mean people who are perfect at all of the skills that are needed. If those people exist, they're going to be expensive, and they probably won't work with you, and you probably won't even be able to challenge them sufficiently. But I am talking about people who have thresholds of knowledge in these skills. Probably they excel at one of them, and they're good enough at the other two. So in other words, people who can analyze data, who can implement algorithms, and who have product sense, who think in product. And trust me, even if your notion is that these are baselines of skills, these are pretty hard people to find and pretty hard people to assess. Now you may wonder, I'm talking about their skills. What about fit? What about culture? What about communication and curiosity? These things matter too, but I'd like you to hold off on these for a while. Let's focus on these kind of three harder skills, if you will, and get back to this. So the question is, what can you learn from an interview? And the whole point is that to interview well, let's think about what the objective, what the goal is. And I'd like to argue that interviewing is a last resort. First off, it's under very unnatural time conditions. I'd like to believe that you don't normally test what people will do in their roles, 30 to 40 minutes, an hour tops. Also, for those of you who are familiar with the work of Daniel Kahneman, the late Amos Tversky on cognitive biases, Dan Ariely, for those a bit later to the field, we have a lot of biases as interviewers. And there's a lot of research showing that we overestimate our ability to learn from interviews. We prefer to hire people who look like us, literally who visually look like us, all sorts of bad reasons for people to make decisions under interview conditions. So actually, the first thing I'd like to say is that if at all possible, don't interview people. Maybe a strange way to talk about interviewing, but let's look at the alternatives. You could only hire people that you've worked with, people you've gone to school with, people you've been in projects with. That's one way. You certainly will have real experiences from working with them. You could also hire interns, which is a great idea. You hire interns, you have them around, they work on cool projects, you make sushi together, at least we do that at LinkedIn, and of course you eventually convert them. And you have a lot of great employees, as you can see. And you could try before you buy. Instead of hiring people directly into full-time positions, why not bring them in as contractors, do a project together, spend several weeks perhaps, and then if it works out, they stay on, and if not, oh well. All these are very plausible, at least on the face of it, alternatives to actually interviewing candidates. But they've got problems. First off, I think most of us can safely say that our pool of people we've worked with is too small. Unless you're an early stage startup, it's unlikely that that pool is large enough to meet your hiring needs. And on top of that, it actually creates a monoculture, a sort of local optimum, that you're not going to hire people who break you out of what you know already. So you might get some people that way, but it's certainly not a sufficient strategy for hiring. And interns are great, but I think people underestimate the cost of hiring through internships. First, to make an internship program successful, it's a huge investment. The sourcing isn't easy. You're competing with everybody else in this room and far more to find your interns. Then when you bring them in, you have to supervise them. I could say that when I've run internship programs, we actually aim for at least a neutral, maybe slightly positive net productivity. That is, we think that the investment that we put in our interns is high enough. We're thrilled if the productivity from the intern more than makes up for that, which it can. But it gives you an idea that this is really something where it's not just cheap labor. It's actually a lot of effort on your part. And then, even when you find these interns, well, maybe some of them aren't good enough for you. The ones who are good enough for you, maybe it turns out you're not good enough for them. Oh, and also, they may not be graduating next year. So this is a long term. Everybody should run internship programs, but it's not going to solve your problems tomorrow, let alone in a year. And finally, try before you buy. Look, it sounds great as an employer, but there's an adverse selection bias. Most of your best people, the candidates that are out there, they're going to get full-time offers from other places. So if you go and say, well, I know you have marriage proposals from everybody else, but I'd like to date for a few months. Yeah, it doesn't go so well. So you end up with folks who perhaps don't have other choices, or perhaps are free-spirited enough that they can afford to do this, but you're, again, not going to meet your needs. So could we at least make interviews more natural? I alluded to the time issue before. Can we make interviewing more representative of working together? We can try. Maybe instead of an interview, you could actually spend the day working together, have a working session, come up with some problem to do together. Some startups do this. It's a nice idea. Another possibility is to give a take-home assignment. Maybe something that takes a day, a weekend, maybe even you give people as long as they'd like, and they come back and they present it. And there, you get a real work deliverable. You can actually pay people to do this even. And you can look at candidates' previous work. Maybe they've published papers that you can find on Google Scholar, or they've done competitions, which you can find on Kaggle. I understand there's some going on even as we speak. You can look at presentations on SlideShare, code that they put in GitHub repositories. All great ways, certainly, to see what people have done before. And again, you're looking at real, natural work that they did under regular conditions, not interview conditions. But 100% natural, a lot of things are natural. I think even arsenic is 100% natural. But I'll pick on HFCS. So working sessions. They're actually a lot harder to set up than they sound. We've looked at these ideas of say, oh, let's analyze data together. But the people coming in have never seen our data before. So are we going to do a huge amount of data cleansing, which is actually a lot of the work they would do in order to make the problem tractable? Well, then it's not all that natural anymore. Are we going to expect them to learn all of this in an hour, a day? So it's more than we expect of our own employees. And needless to say, you have a lot of the same kinds of pressures. If you're not careful, this degenerates back into all the problems with an interview, only it's much longer, requires more investment, and in all likelihood, a lot of your candidates won't want to spend that much time doing this anyway. Take-home assignments, in some sense, take this to another level. They seem really easy for the employer, right? Hey, they're going to do all the work and come back with it. But it's a huge amount of effort for the candidate And again, you generate this kind of adverse selection problem that the candidates who'll do it aren't necessarily the ones that you desire most. And on top of that, if there's any time a candidate is likely to cheat or ask a friend for help, a take-home assignment is where it's likely to happen. So previous work doesn't have these problems, but it's kind of like looking at natural experiments. To the extent that the previous work is completely representative of what you're going to have people do in the job, it's great. But that's unlikely. And even if they've done work just like what we were asking them to do, maybe they haven't published it. Maybe the code was proprietary and therefore isn't in GitHub. So it's great when you can use it, but you really can't count on having previous work to have that predictive value. So you got to interview people, which is a good thing. Otherwise, this talk would somewhat lack a sense of purpose. Question is how? And I'd like to give you 3 principles. So if you're going to take anything away from this talk, I've gotten it down to, I think, 140 characters. That's the goal with these talks, right? And so the 3 principles are that you keep it real, that you have no gotchas, and that maybe equals no. And this may seem a little bit abstract right now, but I'm going to walk through concrete examples of this, which I hope can help all of you with your interviewing. So the first thing is to keep it real. And this may seem obvious that when you do interviewing, you want to actually talk about the real problems that you're going to do. And you don't need to ask people, how many angels can sit on the head of a pin, or what happens if you get lost in a blender. But let's play with this. So I mentioned that hacking skills were one of the requirements for data scientists, which means that people have to be able to code. Now, testing coding is actually pretty difficult to do in interview conditions. I don't know about all of you, but I don't usually code in kind of 45-minute segments at whiteboards or over the phone and so forth. And how I would write code in interview conditions isn't necessarily representative of how I would do it in a sort of natural environment. But some things you can test. So how many folks in the audience have heard of FizzBuzz? Show of hands? Some. For those not familiar with it, it's the problem here. Namely, you want to have a program, language of your choice, that prints out the numbers from 1 to 50, or pick your n. And when the number is a multiple of 3, print fizz. And when it's a multiple of 5, print buzz. And if it's a multiple of both 3 and 5, 15, I'll give you a hint, then FizzBuzz. Now, you'd look at this problem and say, OK, the job description said you have to be able to write code. Come on. But what various people found, and Joel Spolsky blogged about it. My apologies, I can't remember the person who he was citing, that a lot of people whose resumes, or I dare say even LinkedIn profiles, would suggest that they are coders, they might even have degrees in computer science, can't implement this under interview conditions. It's obviously a few lines of code in any reasonable modern language. The point is, this is an easy fail-safe. They can't write something like this, wish them a happy day, maybe find some other job they can do, but it's almost certainly not anything with the words data or science in it. Now, speaking of coding, whiteboards, there's unnatural and there's extremely unnatural. Now, whiteboards are a terrible way to ask people to code. One of the things that we've learned at LinkedIn is that when I was at Google, we did the same. We asked people to write code during phone screens. Now, there are some advantages to this. One is that, of course, if you're going to short circuit based on people's ability to hack, well, you'd like to do that earlier rather than later. But in particular, you can have people work in an editing tool. If you have people come in, they can work off of laptops. Now, there are a lot of things that you can do to make coding reasonable, but having people trying to, relive their nightmares of first-grade penmanship is not one of them. So, actually give people settings that are plausible. But let's get to the substance of what you're going to ask people. I said keep it real. A lot of times, people ask, what they think of are, well, I want to know if they know math, so I'll have them implement the square root function. Or maybe something a bit more sophisticated, like, well, let me see if they know how to implement rehashing in a hash table. Now, I'm not saying that you don't want people who took some computer science classes and maybe even remember the stuff in their, back in my day it was CLR, now CLRS books, pick your algorithms books of choice. But I sure hope nobody that you employ is going to be implementing basic methods like these. Now, we're talking about algorithms here. For testing coding, fine, give something simple. But if you want to test people's ability to implement algorithms, use real problems. For example, one problem that I used until it was outed on Glassdoor, at which point I blogged about it, was string segmentation. This comes from the world of search, but you can imagine it applying to a lot of data cleaning problems or data manipulation ones. You have a string, in this case, big data scientist, and you have a dictionary, which has a bunch of words in it. And you ask, can you figure out if there's a sequence of words in the dictionary that this string could be segmented into? So think of this as the problem that did you mean might have to solve first in a search engine if people entered their tokens without spaces. This is a real problem. How do I know it's a real problem? I had to solve it a few companies ago when I was actually implementing part of the spelling correction for a search engine. And this problem actually has a whole bunch of nice features to it. I'll refer you to my blog post on thenoisychannel.com, which I'll share later. But you can do an easier version of this problem. In fact, I call the FizzBuzz version only try to break it up into 2 words rather than as many as possible. Actually, implementing this, if you don't care about efficiency, turns out you can do it with recursive backtracking. Dynamic programming is my recommended way, or memoization. The point is that this is a real problem that tests basic principles of algorithms, much like square root or dynamic hashing, but involves applying them to something that you would actually need to solve in many work environments. In fact, variations of this sort of segmentation happen all the time. I imagine that many of you have run into it in some form. Or take problems from your own products. So one of the nice things at LinkedIn, our search functionality has a very personalized form of relevance. So for example, if I look up the word architect, you'll see that the results are mostly software architects, while my wife works in real estate. And when she looks up the word architect, she expects architects, the kind who build houses, or at least design them and charge a lot of money for it. Well, imagine yourself, or as an interview candidate, being asked, how would you do this? This isn't, you can look at some of these as coding problems, but of course this is really more of a product design question. And the beauty of this, of course you might be able to get some free ideas from your candidates, but if you're the interviewer, you know something, I hope, about how your own company's products are designed, and you can help candidates explore the space and tease out ideas. Note that there's no one right answer for questions like these, but again, you're working through real problems. And the beauty is that by asking candidates about the real problems you have, you're implicitly selling the candidates on what's cool about your problems. If I'm going to ask people to implement textbook algorithms questions, that tells them nothing about what's cool about solving my company's problems. But if I ask them to implement something like people you may know, maybe only taking up parts of that, or various pieces, say, of a product like LinkedIn Skills. And by the way, a plug, my colleagues Pete and Sam are going to be talking about skills and endorsements in another session. Then not only is this an interesting test, of course, of the candidate's abilities, but you're talking about your space. And some of the feedback I've gotten from candidates is that the interview process actually seems to correspond to the job rather than just some kind of gauntlet they're going through to prove generic worthiness. Of course, this only works if you're hiring people to work on some kinds of problems. So what's implicit in this is that you're not hiring generically. when you're hiring data scientists, you at least have something in mind as to what they're going to do. But no gotchas. This is my second point, which I don't have quite as much to say about, but I'll keep it sweet. Don't have problems where success is about a single insight. Look, what's going to happen in those cases is that if somebody's seen the problem before or something just like it, they'll jump to that insight. If they haven't, they'll struggle for a long time. Your ability to calibrate their struggle is pretty poor. So it's important that your problems have a lot of opportunities for partial credit, and you can give hints along the way. If I go back to that string segmentation problem, there are a variety of ways people can solve the problem, solve parts of that problem, and that you can nudge them. They don't need to suddenly realize that, oh, I need to use some graph algorithm or some data structure in order to solve it. Because otherwise you're really testing something between recall and luck. The second related point is that don't emphasize some niche technique unless it's core to what that person will be doing. Most things can be learned online or learned on the job. So you want to be testing smarts and general skills. If you're testing computer science, use strings, use sets. If you're testing machine learning, of course you expect people to know about decision trees and regression, but maybe not the particulars of some regularization, or you might want them to know about compression, but not necessarily Bloom filters or some specific variation thereof. This seems like a no-brainer, but I've seen a lot of folks who like to kind of give almost a quiz style of tests here, and these really accomplish nothing. The third is be a hard interviewer, but don't be an asshole. My former colleague Steve Stegman was one of his quotes. I encourage folks to follow Stegman quotes on Twitter. Was it's an interview, it's not a first date, but that doesn't mean that you want to push candidates until they cry and then just measure how much pressure it took, like you're titrating them. Forgive the mixed physics-chemistry metaphors, but you communicate your values when you interview. And particularly if a lot of your interviews result in rejections, you're going to have a lot of people who may be pretty incented to go around and badmouth what a horrible process you have. So consider that. And also, for that matter, even if they get in, look, you don't want it to be some kind of a boot camp ritual where they're thrilled to have made it through. The process, when it works, should actually be fun. You're doing problems together. And even when it doesn't work, people should wish they had gotten in and like you. It's not an unreasonable expectation. And after all, the interviews are supposed to kind of be like work, just under slightly less typical conditions. Last point, maybe the most important actually, is that maybe equals no. In fact, I almost want to have everybody repeat after me. 1, 2, 3. Maybe equals no. And I've had to send multiple emails with this subject line. The most fun is when they came back to me from my own team. You have to commit to binary interview outcomes. Forced choice. If somebody is doing an interview, has the opportunity to say, I don't know, it's very tempting to say, I don't know, and pass the buck to somebody else to make the decision. We don't like rejecting people. We don't like destroying people's careers, killing opportunities. Well, if you guys don't know this already, data scientists are in demand. They will get a job at another great company. So you have to distance yourself from some of the emotion in this and understand that yes means you're going to work with them. They better be great. They should be better than you. And one of the variants of this is that if you're not going to go with binary, at least consider having an even number of outcomes. I know, for example, having 5 stars for a rating scale, this kind of Likert scales is encouraging. Do even numbers. Don't have a middle option that gives you an easy way out. If you want, 4, weak and strong, yes and no, but make sure that you force people on some line. And make sure that every person on the team perceives him or herself as a key filter. And in our process at LinkedIn, it's 1 no is pretty harsh, and 2 no's is almost certainly that's it. But it's even more than that. We've had candidates who have gotten a yes from everyone and whom we've still rejected, because when we looked, we realized they were all weak yeses. I actually wrote a post recently that probably the hiring process is taking on too much of the burden of evaluation, because once you've hired someone, deciding that the person wasn't a fit and firing for performance is a very harsh and heavy thing to do. I actually think that's a problem, but it's a problem we have to live with. And that means you have to be ruthlessly cautious and conservative in the interviewing process, unless, like a small minority of companies, you're ready in 3 months to say it didn't work out, you're out. Finally, short-circuit candidates as early in the process as possible. Let's say you have a resume screen and say, well, maybe, there are a couple of buzzwords in there. Let's phone screen them. You do a phone screen. And they make it through the phone screen. I don't know. We should bring them on site. They come on site and they're decimated. Think about how much time you spent, just from a resource perspective. But even more so, think about what this does to your interviewers. At a previous company, the phone screens were way too liberal. They were not much more than a FizzBuzz because, hey, what can you learn from a phone screen? Well, I'll tell you, you can learn a lot. Make your phone screens hard, because if the typical on-sites are going to be rejections, then your interviewers are going to go in really annoyed, hating to do interviews, because after all, their priors are that 90% of those people will be rejected anyway, so why can't they get back to their day jobs instead of wasting their time? If you make the phone screens much more rigorous, yes, you will lose people. You will lose good people. But you will spend far more of your time actually interviewing people that you're likely to hire. And my recommendation is your on-site percentage of acceptance should be in the area of 50%. I don't think you can get much higher than that without the phone screens being ridiculously conservative. But at that point, your interviewers get excited because everyone they're talking to, this is a decent shot. This is somebody that they're going to be trying to close. And that does a huge amount for the value that people put in there. And what about the 3 C's? Culture, communication, curiosity? Of course they matter. But you should be getting feedback about them in every single interview that you do. After all, interviewing involves communication. Problem solving expresses curiosity. And culture, well, culture is how, to a large extent, how this person is going to interact with people on your team. As long as your whole team is doing the interviews, you're going to get N data points on all of these. So they matter, but there's no point in trying to test them independently. You'll get them. So remember your goal. These people are really hard to get, but you have some principles you can follow. You keep it real. Your coding, filter easy on the easy side with FizzBuzz. Use actual real-world algorithm problems that are motivated by your own products and data problems, design problems that come from there. If those problems are interesting, you have a harder time than I can help you with. No gotchas. They just create a lot of noise, and you should have problems with lots of partial credit, room for exploration. You're not testing for niche or single insights. And maybe equals no. Look, bad hires suck, so be conservative and trust your team. If you even have 1 or 2 people on your team saying no, wait. You'll find the right person. So with that, I'd like to thank you and have time for a couple of questions. The back?
Very interesting. I think a lot of what you said is standard in certainly some of the best tech companies, but it felt to me as if you really gave a lot of relatively generic advice that I would assume happens in an interview for software engineers. I think the talk was titled "How to Interview for Data Science." Mm-hmm. I find this difficult because this changes a little bit the kind of questions one asks. And for instance, coding question on the whiteboard or wherever is, I think, less relevant. But I personally find it really difficult to come up with good data scientist questions. And I wanted to see whether you have something to say about that.
Sure. So the question is, how is this different from interviewing software engineers? I think there's actually a lot in common. And so I think that certain amount of coding, regardless of what language it's in, right? Even if you're asking people to write a pig script for you, or write some JavaScript or what have you. There's still a notion there. But specifically as far as what makes it a data science problem, the majority of the interviewing that we do is actually asking people to work their way through implementing a recommendation, for example. And there, a lot of it is asking, where would you find that data? How would you come up with your objective functions and so forth? I can't give generic advice there because I actually think that what you want to ask people to do is solve your product problems. If those aren't data problems inherently, then why are you hiring data scientists? Whether it's an analysis problem or one there.
The problem is that then we spend like easily 45 minutes explaining my problems because my experience is real problems are difficult to explain and very difficult to get across in an interview. So I think the questions have to be somewhat distilled to fit into an interview schedule.
I'll respectfully disagree. As an example, when I gave the search relevance problem or the segmentation problem, those are real problems, and they take very little time to set up. I agree that you may have to do some simplification or abstraction. I don't think it's that hard to take the core of a problem in your space and make it something that's worthy of discussion in a 45-minute session.
Yeah, the one thing that I didn't hear you mention, which I think I'd be interested in your comment on, is when I've interviewed people, I want to know if they're going to make the current job and they meet the qualifications to do the work. But I also want to know how to find out from them what I need to invest in them to get them to a level where I really want them to be longer term. And so I always look at it as like two-tiered. When I talk to a candidate, I sort of introduce both. And sometimes questions aren't qualifying for the job. It's also to help me, because if I bring you on, I'm going to want to know what I can push you to do longer term. So
the question is like, what's their longer term passion, and how do you get that? So it comes, I guess, to the 3 C's. I don't think that you can explicitly ask for that in the form of questions, but I think that passion is something that hopefully everybody on the team has and actually is sensitive to. You could ask directly, hey, what do you want? What do you want to be? It's not a bad idea to do that, but what I found is across the team, people get a sense of that. When you ask them to solve a problem, they're trying to do more. When it seems hard, they see that as excitement, as opposed to, oh my God, what are you making me do? Maybe a bit fuzzy, but one of the ways you can test for these kinds of soft things in general is to see if you get agreement across the interviewers as to whether somebody possesses a trait. And if they do, trust the collective gut instincts. It's kind of, crowdsourcing in the small. One last question, and then I should give this to you. Yes.
Let's say that somebody came up with a killer feature, but somehow you didn't hire that person because of the culture fit or communication issues. Do you have no intellectual property concerns at that point? Maybe you'll use the...
So the question is, what if somebody gives you IP during the interview? If somebody discloses something to you not under NDA and hasn't patented it already, it's the protections are limited. But I'll be I'm not a lawyer, obviously, but more realistically, if somebody under interview conditions is able to provide some kind of killer feature for your product and chooses to do so thinking it's the sort of thing they should just put in there, I dare say that you probably as a company aren't trying hard enough, or you have people who are so passionate about being there they want to do that. I haven't ever found that to be a problem, but as I said, I'm not a lawyer, but I've never heard of a situation where an interview candidate sued an interviewer for appropriating what they did in their 30 or 40 minutes. I'm happy to take questions during the break or afterwards. I'm around for the full 3 days, but I need to yield to my next speaker. So thank you again.